Hello, welcome back. It's been a minute, it feels like, but I had a couple books I wanted to talk about. Kind of typical books for me, I guess, because I feel like I've talked about this on here before, but I am a big fan of memoirs, and so I have a couple of memoir recommendations. These particular ones being not just memoirs, but graphic novel memoirs. So not only do they do the interesting life story and learning about someone's past and perspective that I really like in a memoir, but they were also really fast reads because they're graphic novels. So if you're wanting to maybe get into memoirs and that kind of thing, these might be a good place for you to start if you're not sure if you can handle like a full novel style one. So let's just hop right into it. The first one that we have is The Best That We Could Do, and I didn't look up how to pronounce the author's name because I completely forgot, but this is by a Vietnamese American author. Her family lived in Vietnam, and then when she was a child during the Vietnam War, they ended up immigrating to America. So that's the general storyline of what's in here. I really liked how it was done, though. Not just that it was like an interesting story and perspective, that I knew like some of that immigration and stuff was happening during the Vietnam War, but I hadn't really heard anyone's specific story of it, so that was really nice and interesting. But it's also framed in the context of the author herself first becoming a mother. It opens with her giving birth to her son, and then it kind of trails through this whole family history and things, and how she ended up at that point based on how her family went through all these things. And it talks a bit about some generational traumas that came from them having to be survivors through so much wartime in Vietnam, and just kind of how all of these experiences and things colored her life and her experience, and how in some ways it seemed like becoming a mother for her tied in all those stories for her and maybe developed some of like her curiosity in finding out more about that past, because she was fairly young when her family left Vietnam, so she doesn't remember a lot of it. But yeah, it was really beautiful. I really liked it. Here's kind of a sampling of what like the art and stuff looks like. I found it really interesting, and I really liked hearing this kind of perspective because, like I said, I knew some of these things happened during the Vietnam War, but it's very different to get that personal kind of story and perspective to it. I think a lot of these were like transcripts and stuff from conversations she had with her parents, because she's been like recording their family history and things and trying to collect that as a way of remembering. So it was really cool to just get all that perspective in that story and to learn more about Vietnam in general. And yeah, I really liked the perspective this gave too about the war itself, and how, for example, in America it gets kind of portrayed as one thing, but having lived through it, it's obviously a different experience of having lived in Vietnam and seeing the different conflicts and politics that way. And yeah, it was just good. I really enjoyed this, and I think this is a very good place to start if you're looking for maybe some memoir that's lighter, is probably not quite the word because it does talk about war and all of that, but you know, that's a little easier to get into. It does look fairly big, but again, since it's a graphic novel, it is overall a really fast read. So there's that. And then the second one I've got is one that I'd been wanting to read for a while. I don't remember when I first heard about this, but this is They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, who you may know from Star Trek. So this talks about his early experience as a child in America when the Japanese ended up being put into internment camps, which was definitely a thing I knew about. I live in Utah, and back in elementary school, there was at least one unit that talked about the internment camps. I think specifically it talked about Manzanar, and then also the one that was in Utah, which is Topaz. So I knew that like internment camps were a thing. Never really gotten anyone's story about it, so getting kind of that personal experience of it and that personal touch to it made it a lot more real that this was a thing that happened in America. This was how people were treated, all of that kind of thing. And it's especially interesting, I feel like, through his lens, because he was such a young child during it too, that a lot of it for him was like, well, this is just childhood. Children adapt to lots of things really easily, so in a lot of ways he didn't recognize a lot of what the situation was until he was older, and so that kind of perspective to it was also really interesting. There were also a few lines and things that were in this that I wanted to make note of, because it does talk about racism and things obviously a lot as well, because it is about people who were interred in camps because of their race, despite the fact that a lot of them were like American-born citizens and just happened to have that family history of their family came from Japan, and then Pearl Harbor, and then it was like everyone who's Japanese, whether they were born in America or have immigrated to America, are all like the enemy and all of that. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was here. This is one of the ones I marked, where he talks about how that experience of getting treated that way and how that affects them. So what he says is, years later, the trauma of those experiences continued to haunt me. Most Japanese Americans from my parents' generation didn't like to talk about the internment with their children. As with many traumatic experiences, they were anguished by their memories and haunted by the shame for something that wasn't their fault. Shame is a cruel thing. It should rest on the perpetrators, but they don't carry it the way the victims do. And like, just this little thought here, it was like, man, yeah, that's true. Like the victims of things like this, you know, that's like the survivor's guilt kind of stories and things. Survivor's guilt is maybe not exactly accurate for this context, but, you know, there are those feelings and that shame that rests on you as a person, like, did I do something wrong to end up in this context? Whereas really those feelings should be upon the person who put those things on you, and it just weighs on you anyways, despite that. And it really touched me to read that line, and I felt like empathy and things, and it was like, oh, it's so unfortunate that people have to go through that, and then having gone through that, they feel like it's their fault, even though they're not the ones who put that on themselves, and it's a rough situation, you know. Okay, and then, let's see, there was another one I had marked off that he's talking about his own experience learning in the future, kind of looking back on the internment camps, how he had all these conversations with his father, and kind of his experience learning about it in that context too. I had to learn about the internment from my father during our after-dinner conversations. That remains part of the problem, that we don't know the unpleasant aspects of American history, and therefore we don't learn the lessons those chapters have to teach us, so we repeat them over and over again. And this really touched me too. Like, I mentioned already that I did technically learn about the internment camps, but it wasn't like a big history unit. It wasn't across multiple grades or anything that I remember. It was just like that one time, and I suspect that part of it was probably because I live in Utah and there was one here in Utah, and I don't know if other curriculums really talked about them. And so I felt this deeply, that it's like, it's unfortunate that a lot of this is still so much oral history instead of really being a part of like the history that we're taught in school and things. We've got like Black History Month, but do we talk about like the internment camps and things that we do too? And obviously Black history is also really important, but I just mean it's frustrating that there are all these little elements of our own history that get hidden because it's either just easier not to talk about them, or they're not like a big enough issue to talk about and contextualize in a history class or whatever. So I hope that this book helps people to learn some of those lessons, and it seems like it's being taught that way more and has been distributed in such a means that it can be, but hopefully that just brings more awareness to these things, because obviously it doesn't do any good to just hide them away and not talk about them, because as he said in that then means that we're just not learning and we're redoing the same things over and over ad nauseum. Then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, part of what he does is he does have some things like the lists where all the names of those people were, and he then contextualizes even this and says, as devastating as the experience was for my family, it's important to understand that we were not unique. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned in these camps, each with their own stories to tell, and they deserve to be more than statistics. And that was one of the big things I came away from this too, and kind of from memoirs in general. Like, I really appreciate hearing those personalized stories that contextualize history and stuff, and I wish that we had more of these, and I hope that potentially maybe because of his book we'll get more stories about this sort of thing. But history is one thing to be taught, and it's obviously important to learn about things like that the internment camps existed, but it just feels like such a different and personal thing when you're just getting like a history textbook version of it, whereas with like memoirs, I feel like that really brings it to you and helps you learn about how an experience of such things was as an individual and what your life might have been like had you been put in that situation, versus just here's kind of the dry history textbook version of it. So I had lots of thoughts that hopefully weren't too rambly and made a lot of sense, but yeah, if you're looking for some graphic novels and or memoirs, I recommend both of these very much. And I hope that lots of people read and learn from these stories and can empathize and relate to the kind of individual experience that these people are trying to tell, and hopefully we'll get more of those individual stories shared with us as well as time goes on. Yeah, but I think that's all I've got for now. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you have further recommendations of graphic novel memoirs that you think I might like, feel free to share down below. But yeah, that's all I've got for now. This is the Umlaut Herper signing out.